The movie starts.
The seamstress Annie Munch, daughter of Wilhelm Munch, is to be sterilized.
Another Nazi crime against humanity.
The crimes of Nazi Germany began in peacetime with sterilization. It wasn't until the war that the killing began.
How could it come to this?
Are you aware that sexual sterilization was not invented by National Socialism, but had been advanced for years before as a weapon in dealing with the mentally incompetent and the criminal?
Yes, I'm aware of that.
Well, the eugenics movement started in the UK, but it was in the US where it really took off and got political approval. The guy who made forced sterilizations really popular in the US was the American zoologist Charles Davenport. He was an expert in statistics. Until 1909, he was a specialist for the breeding of cats and chickens. Then he went to Great Britain, met Galton and Pearson, and decided to apply all the knowledge to the breeding of humans. Davenport published a bunch of scientific papers, with his most famous being Heredity in Relation to Eugenics. It was used as a textbook at universities for many years. He argued that traits are inherited and that humans should therefore reproduce through targeted selections, like cats and chickens do.
Who's even going to defend something like that?
Former President Theodore Roosevelt wrote to Davenport in 1913.
It is really extraordinary that our people refuse to apply to human beings such knowledge as every successful farmer is obliged to apply to his stock breeding. I agree with you that society has no business to permit degenerates to reproduce their kind.
In 1922, Davenport published Race Crossing in Jamaica, in which he portrayed intermarriage with blacks as danger. Another early advocate of eugenics was Madison. He came from a wealthy background and one of his ancestors signed the Declaration of Independence. In 1916, Grant published The Passing of the Great Race, in which he argued in favor of scientific racism. He advocated Northernism. According to this, the Northern race is said to be superior but threatened by the Southern race. His theories were also very influential in Germany.
North and South are primarily geographical terms.
The Germans claim to be of the same race as the English. Another important source of support came from the feminists, who were very active at the time. They founded numerous local associations to implement eugenics. Margaret Sanger was the most prominent feminist in favor of eugenics. She's a complex personality because she also did a lot of good and actively and successfully campaigned for women's rights. She founded Planned Parenthood, which still exists today. Planned Parenthood helps women with abortions. It is today the largest single provider of reproductive health services and the largest single provider of abortions in the US.
My body, my right.
At the same time, Margaret Sanger was a member of the Ku Klux Klan. Most eugenics were racist, but some black people were involved too. The most well-known was the human rights activist Du Bois. He was the first black man to graduate from Harvard. He said that 10% of the best black men should be equal to 10% of the best white man.
The Negro race, like all races, is going to be saved by its exceptional men. The problem of education, then, among Negroes must first of all deal with the talented 10th. It is the problem of developing the best of this race that they may guide the mass away from the contamination and death of the worst in their own and other races.
There was also positive eugenics in the USA. During this time, better baby contests were popular. They checked out the health of babies, with the healthiest ones getting a prize. They looked at weight, height, and mental characteristics.
Isn't that usually done for livestock?
Yes, they were set up at the same state fairs, where they judged and gave out prizes for cattle. The idea was to help mothers take better care of their babies' health.
This is some kind of education.
The eugenicists were not short of money. Many millionaires were generous donors. They got their money from the Rockefeller Foundation, the Harriman Railroad fortune, and the Carnegie Institution. Kellogg financed the Race Betterment Foundation. The foundation mostly organized conferences. Davenport set up the Eugenics Record Office with money from the Carnegie Foundation. It was basically a research institute that was all about promoting eugenics. To do this, it collected data on the American population through questionnaires. They looked at family trees and focused on collecting info from poor families. He believed he could prove that stupidity is passed down through generations. In this way, he collected large amounts of data.
Isn't that stupid?
Back then, most people in the US, apart from African Americans, were Protestants who had immigrated from Northern Europe. They were afraid of the new immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe, who were Catholic, Orthodox or Jewish. These people had different cultures and religions. There had been 20 million new arrivals since 1870, which was a 50% increase in the population. The older Americans thought the new immigrants were inferior. From 1917, the government passed several laws to reduce immigration. The politicians were influenced by the eugenicists. Firstly, new conditions were attached to entry. Immigrants had to prove that they were not illiterate and could read a text in their native language. Mentally defective people were banned from entering the country, as were homosexuals, because they were categorized as mentally defective. Immigration quotas were introduced, which were particularly low for people from Southern and Eastern Europe.
America stopped being a country of immigration.
The next step was to make forced sterilization legal, and the people they saw as inferior were the ones who should be sterilized. There was a lot of support for it, so it became legal. In the US, it's up to each state to decide on this. Indiana was the first to do it, as early as 1907. And then California, Washington, Virginia, North Carolina, Connecticut, Iowa, Michigan, Kansas.
Stop! You don't need to list all 32 states.
Most of the people who were sterilized were women, but there were some men too. In California, 12,000 women were sterilized in just 28 years, and most of them were Latino. In other states, it was Black and Native American women. Most of the time, the women weren't told about sterilization. They were made to believe it was a routine operation that was good for their health.
Was there no resistance at all? What about the Supreme Court? Is something like this even compatible with the American Constitution?
The eugenicists were asking themselves the same question. Could their policies be constitutional? To find out, they used a ruse. This is a 1970 case of Buck versus Bear. Carrie Buck was a girl who was raped, got pregnant and was put in a home by her foster parents. There, she was labeled a moron and forcibly sterilized. A lawyer who was on the eugenicist side told Carrie Buck he would help her and take legal action. The lawyer went all the way to the Supreme Court and lost every time in purpose. As a result, forced sterilizations in the US became compatible with the 14th Amendment, which says discrimination is not allowed. The Supreme Court justified its judgment with the remark,
"3 generations of imbeciles are enough."
The judgment was never overturned.
And how did the public react to this?
Forced sterilization was generally not so well known. It wasn't until the 1930s that attitudes started to change. It was around then that the film Tomorrow's Children came out. It tells the story of a 17-year-old girl from a poor background who is due to be sterilized. But then, when they found out she was actually being adopted, that changed everything. But it was a low-budget film produced outside the studio system. The movie shocked the film industry, and distribution was only possible in Pennsylvania and Ohio. It was the Ann Cooper Hewitt case that really opened people's eyes. Anne was sterilized by a surgeon in a routine operation. Without her knowledge. Her mother had been the one to suggest it. She claimed she was feeble-minded to get it done. Her idea was to get the inheritance from her late husband and Anne's dad. Before the sterilization, the doctors wanted Anne to take a test, but she refused. So they said she was feeble-minded. Anne then took her mother to court. The public was on her side. But the case was dropped and Anne got $150,000 in compensation.
This would make a great movie.
At the same time, other countries like Norway, Sweden and Japan were also running sterilization programs. But eugenics was the most brutal in Germany. One of the first people to publicly back it was Alfred Plötz. He was a doctor who wrote a book about the theory of racial hygiene. However, eugenics only gained political influence after the National Socialists seized power in 1933. They passed a law right away that made it compulsory for alcoholics and the mentally ill to get sterilized. The Nazi law was based on a law in California. Doctors had to report patients with these disorders, and then a hereditary health court would order sterilization. There were 250 of these courts pretty soon. Between 300,000 and 400,000 Germans were sterilized. Hitler was an admirer of Madison Grant's racial theory, and he even wrote him a letter of praise.
There are compliments you don't want to receive.
But for Hitler, sterilization did not go far enough. In 1939, with the outbreak of war, patients were no longer sterilized, they were murdered. For the first time in Germany, gas was used to kill people. 10,000 mentally ill people were gassed. There was also a positive eugenics program. On the one hand, German women were asked to draw up a family tree to show that they had no foreign ancestors. If this was the case, they were encouraged to have many children. But this did not go far enough for some Nazis. Himmler set up the Lebensborn project to raise Aryan children. To do this, he kidnapped children from German-occupied territories if they had Aryan features such as blue eyes and blonde hair.
Blonde hair and blue eyes are not unusual among the Berbers in Algeria.
The Nuremberg trials indicted the doctors who carried out the forced sterilizations.
They distorted, they perverted, they destroyed justice and law in Germany.
The lawyer for the German war criminals said, "How can they accuse my clients of a crime that their own Supreme Court has declared legal?"
Since the opinion upholds the sterilization law in the state of Virginia of the United States.
Most of the German doctors who were charged were not convicted, because the cases were dropped.
With these crimes, eugenics was finally finished.
Not quite. Eugenics was still in force in the US, though more discreetly. Positive eugenics was promoted through a sperm database. The best known was the repository for germinal choice, where only men with a Nobel Prize or at least a high IQ were allowed to donate their sperm. It operated between 1979 and 1999. But negative eugenics also persisted. Forced sterilization remained legal in most states until the end of the 1970s. Nobel Prize winner William Shockley wanted to pay money to anyone with an IQ below 100 to be sterilized. He claimed that eugenics was important for human survival and that black people were inferior. At the same time, he said that Jews were superior to East Asians and Europeans.
In the end, racism is like a war of everyone against everyone.
Eugenics was used particularly harshly against Native Americans. Between 1970 and 1976, 40% of Native American women and 10% of Native American men were sterilized. This was revealed in a report by the General Accounting Office. The sterilizations were carried out by the Indian Health Service. The victims were sterilized during medical procedures without being asked or informed. The scandal was exposed by the Red Power movement, which has been campaigning for the rights of Native Americans. It took until 1978 for the Indian Child Welfare Act to end the practice. The Native American birth rate dropped from 3.3 per mother in 1970 to 1.3 in 1980.
It's almost like genocide.
It is stated that your mother suffered from hereditary feeble-mindedness.
That's not true, not true, not true.
The world looks very different when you analyze it with statistics and figures, or when you look at each individual case. For eugenicists, the fate of an individual is nothing more than an anonymous number. Crimes against individuals seems rational to them. But rationality is a matter of perspective.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe. See you next time.